It started with a scream no one could trace. The voice tore through the midnight broadcast like glass, splintering inside a cathedral. Every television flickered to life, though none were plugged in, and on every screen, an identical face mouthing silent words no one could understand. In that impossible moment, an invisible hand reached through the signal, marking every watcher. Days later, their reflections began to move on their own. This wasn't urban legend. It was recorded, logged, and buried. But sometimes, late at night, the same broadcast resurfaces, carrying with it a static that hums like breathing. If you hear it, don't listen. If you see it, don't blink. And if your reflection ever stops following you, run. The tape wasn't supposed to exist. When the technicians found it in the archive, it had no label, no timestamp, no metadata. The moment they played it, every monitor displayed a frozen image of an abandoned studio, until one of the figures on screen blinked. The room temperature dropped instantly. In the footage, a single chair turned by itself. Voices layered over one another, whispering through frequencies that shouldn't have carried sound. The lead engineer swore he saw someone standing behind the camera, even though no reflection appeared in the glass. That night, the footage vanished. But the sound still plays through empty frequencies, as though the broadcast is waiting for a new host. In a small town far from the city, the same broadcast resurfaced. Radios buzzed with a hidden frequency between stations, whispering in perfect unison, "Do you see us?" The signal infected everything. Phones, cameras, even mirrors began to shimmer like liquid glass. A teenager filmed the phenomenon before disappearing. All that remained was a short clip, a living room drenched in flickering light, a figure standing motionless before a dark screen that suddenly smiled back. Investigators tried to trace the origin, but every lead circled back to a decommissioned transmission tower that was never built on any record. The survivors described an impossible phenomenon. Their reflections began moving seconds after they did. Every motion delayed. Every blink echoed. One by one, they began seeing themselves standing still in mirrors, watching, waiting. Experts dismissed it as collective hysteria until the lab's security footage revealed something else entirely. One reflection stepping out of the mirror while the subject collapsed lifelessly. The scientists shut down the experiment, but the reflections didn't vanish. They continued appearing, always near screens, always just behind someone's shoulder. Weeks later, a new transmission surfaced online, a perfect recreation of the first broadcast. Only this time the reflection spoke. Its voice was wrong, layered with static and distortion, each syllable dragging like a broken tape. "We are what you see when you shouldn't look," it said. Then the screen split into dozens of faces, each belonging to someone who had watched the original broadcast. The footage ended with a single frame of an eye staring directly through the lens. Analysts froze it, enhanced it, and discovered something horrifying: the reflection of the viewer, recorded in impossible detail. The first casualty of the signal appeared in the middle of a primetime news broadcast. As the anchorwoman smiled through the usual script, her reflection behind her began to smile back. But the reflection's smile was wrong. Twisting, contorting, too wide, the reflection moved independently, mimicking her actions but adding strange jerks and pauses, like it was struggling to catch up. The studio audience was frozen in terror, unable to look away. The broadcast cut off abruptly, but the footage of the incident spread like wildfire, sparking a chain reaction across all news outlets. Soon, all televised faces were out of sync, and the lines between screen and reality began to blur. A team of investigators, all eager to uncover the truth behind the disturbances, visited a local mall where strange occurrences had been reported. In an empty hallway, they found a row of polished mirrors, all reflecting nothing but the hallway. At least, that's what they thought. until one investigator, a young man in his 20s, with a bold, brash attitude, stepped too close to one mirror. His reflection remained motionless, staring straight at him, but when he reached out to touch it, the reflection stepped out of the glass. The rest of the team fled, but not before capturing the terrifying moment on camera. The footage shows him running, only to be chased by his own reflection. After the mall incident, strange footage began to surface on various streaming platforms, live broadcasts that no one had aired. Every viewer who tuned in saw the same thing, a lonely road stretching into an infinite horizon. At first, the scene seemed peaceful. Then, faint figures began walking along the road, their movements jerky, as if trapped between dimensions. The more viewers watched, the more the figures would notice them, turning their heads, eyes bulging out in silent screams. And with each passing moment, the viewer would feel their body grow heavier, as if the figures were slowly stepping into their reality. The feed would end only when the viewers could no longer move, their minds overtaken by the broadcast. The government began experimenting with countermeasures, trying to trace the source of the signal. They set up a secret facility to study its effects, but one of the scientists, a woman in her, strong-willed but increasingly anxious, fell victim to the phenomenon. While staring into an observation mirror, she watched in horror as her own reflection slowly twisted, its smile stretching impossibly wide, its fingers twitching as if reaching out. The reflection leaned in close, whispering something unintelligible. A few seconds later, she collapsed, her body twitching uncontrollably. The footage showed her reflection, now fully free, standing over her as she lay motionless on the ground. The phenomenon reached its peak during a live presidential address, broadcast across the nation. As the president spoke, the camera cut to a wide shot of the speech hall. A figure stood in the back of the room, obscured by shadows. The camera zoomed in, only to reveal that it was the reflection of the president himself, standing behind the real figure. The moment the camera focused on it, the reflection stepped forward, taking control of the president's movements. The broadcast ended abruptly, leaving only stat. When the screen cleared, the president's eyes were empty, his face expressionless. The signal had found its vessel. The world was no longer the same. Cities flickered and warped, caught between moments like a glitch in the system. People who had watched the broadcast began to disappear, their faces never to be seen again, their voices never to be heard. News channels reported strange disturbances, but no one truly understood what was happening. As the signal spread, the once distinct lines between the digital world and physical reality blurred. In an abandoned hospital, an old television was found playing an endless loop of the first broadcast. The hospital had been deserted for years, yet when the tape was played, a figure appeared on screen, a reflection of a man and his eyes wild with terror, begging for help. But when the crew turned to him, he was nowhere to be found. One of the few survivors, a young woman in her late teens, had locked herself in her apartment for weeks. She had seen her own reflection move without her. Now, every time she glanced in a mirror, it was no longer a reflection. It was an eye. No matter how far away she was from the mirror, the eye would follow her every movement, tracking her every glance. The eye's pupils shifted, expanding and contracting, almost as if it were waiting for something. The terror grew so unbearable that one night she smashed the mirror in a panic, only to hear the eye whisper, "You can't hide from me." The apartment was silent the next morning, and the girl was gone. Her reflection, however, remained. The signal had spread far beyond television screens. It now bled into people's dreams. A man and a father, desperate to find his family, began hearing voices in his head, all coming from the same eerie static. It called his name over and over again. One night, He woke to find his wife and children gone. The house empty, save for a single flickering television. The broadcast showed the faces of his family, all staring directly into the camera, their eyes hollow and dark. As he watched, he heard his daughter's voice crackling through the static. "Daddy, it's too late." He turned. But when he looked back, the family was gone, and the room was filled with static. As the signal continued to unravel reality, reflections began appearing in places they shouldn't be. Windows, puddles, even glass surfaces like tabletops. They were no longer passive. They moved independently, their expressions twisted with malice. A man in his, walking home from work, stopped at a street corner, only to see his reflection in a storefront window smiling back at him. He turned to look, and his reflection continued to smile. As he slowly walked away, the reflection stayed behind, its smile growing wider and wider. The man's legs began to buckle beneath him, paralyzed by fear. He never made it home. In a last-ditch effort to stop the growing madness, a small group of remaining scientists initiated the final broadcast. It was meant to be a signal of hope, a way to take control of the phenomenon and shut it down. Instead, it opened the door to a new kind of terror. As the transmission began, the faces of everyone who had ever watched the broadcast appeared on screen, their eyes empty, their mouths moving in unison. The signal had gained sentience, and now it was broadcasting itself to everyone. People began to hear whispers in their ears, voices that weren't their own. They could no longer trust their senses. Reality fractured, folding in on itself. For a brief moment, the entire world seemed to exist inside the static. Then, there was only silence. Reality had splintered beyond repair. The survivors, those few who hadn't been consumed by the signal, wandered through a world that no longer resembled their own. A man in his, once a scientist now broken by the madness, stood in the center of an abandoned city square. The buildings were cracked, their windows shattered, and the air hummed with a low, constant static. Through the distortion, a voice echoed, deep, resonant, and alive. It was the signal, now fully conscious. It spoke through every television, every radio, and every phone. "You are part of me now," it whispered. The man's reflection, long gone from any surface, now stared back at him from the static. He could hear it call his name. It was time to join them. The reflections had begun to merge with reality, stepping out of mirrors and glass, forming new beings that were not quite human. A woman in her hair now completely white, walked through a mall that had been abandoned for weeks. The walls were coated with a thick layer of dust, and the glass doors reflected back an impossible scene, dozens of versions of herself, all standing in silent, empty poses. She tried to run, but the reflections moved in perfect synchronization with her, trapping her in an endless maze of mirrored halls. Every corner she turned, a new version of herself stared back. The reflections began to speak, each voice a whisper. "You cannot escape us," they said. "You are part of us." The transmission tower that had once broadcast the signal had become a monument to the new world. Its towering spire loomed over the landscape, surrounded by a field of twisted metal and broken screens. A young woman in a survivor of the earlier chaos, approached the tower. She had heard whispers, promises that the signal could be stopped. As she climbed the crumbling steps toward the top, she could see the faces of the lost. They were all there, trapped in the static, their faces pressed against the glass of the screens that surrounded the tower. When she reached the top, the sky twisted above her, a whirlpool of static and distortion, and the faces reached out, their eyes pleading. The signal was alive, and it had finally found a way to take full control. The signal had finally consumed everything. Buildings, cities, landscapes. They all turned into pixelated distortions, shifting between moments, flickering in and out of focus. A man in his, a former journalist who had chronicled the collapse of the world, now found himself in a place where nothing was real. Yet everything was familiar. He walked through a town square that was both ancient and modern, and in every window, the reflections of people he had once known stared back at him, their faces twisted in fear and confusion. As he walked further, the environment around him began to pixelate, the ground warping beneath his feet. The signal had rewritten the very fabric of reality. He was trapped in the space between the digital and physical worlds. There was no escape. And then, as if the world had been holding its breath, everything stopped. There was no more static, no more reflections, no more noise. A woman in her, the last of the survivors, stood in a barren field under a pale sky. Her clothes were ragged, her face tired, but her eyes were determined. She had witnessed the end of the world, and now, for the first time in weeks, there was silence. She raised her hand, reaching for something she could no longer comprehend. The signal had taken everything: her family, her reality, and her world. But in the quiet, she realized one horrifying truth. The signal was still there. It was in her. And she would never be alone again. The world that once was now seemed like a dream, fractured and unreal. The survivors who hadn't succumbed to the signal wandered through a landscape where every surface shimmered with static. A young man in his, who had lost everything, stared out across the horizon, now barren and endless. In the distance, buildings that once stood strong were reduced to skeletal frames, flickering in and out of existence like old film reels. The air was thick with an unsettling hum. The ground beneath his feet felt wrong, almost like it was being rewritten by some unseen force. He could still hear whispers, voices he knew, calling from the static. But when he turned to look, there was no one there. It was as if the signal had devoured them, leaving only their echoes behind. The signal had begun to evolve. No longer content with simply distorting reality, it began to create, mimicking the lost souls it had absorbed, forming twisted versions of them in the image of the world it was consuming. A woman in her, once a scientist in the final efforts to halt the signal, ventured into a forgotten cathedral, now overrun by flickering screens. She had heard of this place, the heart of the signal, the origin of its power. As she entered, the screens around her came to life, each one showing a different reflection of her own face. They whispered in unison, their voices distorted, repeating the same question, "Are you one of us?" Her reflection on the altar was no longer her own, but something else, a dark, twisted version, her eyes hollow and smiling. The survivors had learned the truth. The signal was not just a phenomenon. It was a living entity, a force that fed on memories, emotions, and the very fabric of reality. A man in his 40s, who had been one of the last to hold on to hope, found himself standing in front of a glass wall, his own reflection staring back at him. He could no longer distinguish between the reflection and the real world. As he touched the glass, the reflection moved with him, but something was different. His reflection began to step closer, its eyes not his own, its expression twisted into something other. A moment later, the reflection reached through the glass, grabbing his arm. He screamed, but it was already too late. His body flickered out of existence, swallowed whole by the reflection. The signal had not just consumed their bodies, it had replaced them. A young woman, once an artist, now wandered through an abandoned city, her mind unraveling. She reached the outskirts of the city where an enormous wall of static rose, blocking her way. She tried to turn back, but the faces of those she once knew were now embedded in the wall, their eyes wide with terror. As she reached out, one of the faces opened its mouth, whispering her name. She could feel herself becoming part of the wall, her body starting to dissolve into the static, her identity replaced with a hollow echo of who she once was. There was no escape. She was already part of the signal. There was no more time, No more world. The signal had consumed everything, leaving nothing but static in its wake. A woman in her, the last of the survivors, stood at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the abyss. The earth had crumbled. The horizon flickered with a million reflections, all trapped in the signal's web. As she stepped forward, she felt herself becoming part of the static, her body slowly dissipating into the ether. There was no scream, no fear, just a quiet, infinite pull into the void. In the final moment, she realized that she had always been a part of it. The signal had won. There was no longer a distinction between the digital and the real. The world had been consumed, and all that remained was an eternal echo. There was no more sun, no more stars. The sky was a fractured canvas of static and broken signals, an endless black sea. The land was reshaped, twisted into forms that defied nature, all remnants of human civilization now dissolving into nothingness. A man and his, once a teacher, wandered through the ruins of what was once a city. His clothes were torn, his face haggard, but his eyes were alert. He could still feel the signal in the air, buzzing like a forgotten hymn. As he walked, he heard a distant voice, his own, calling out to him from the void. "Are you still here?" The man paused, trembling. He had been lost for what felt like eternity. But the voice was real, or was it? His reflection, long abandoned, now flickered in the broken shards of glass on the ground. He wasn't sure if it was him, but something was watching him. Something far older than the signal itself. In the silence of the new world, the reflections never stopped moving. A woman in her early, standing alone in a derelict room, gazed into an old cracked mirror. For weeks, she had seen nothing but her own face, her own eyes staring back at her, until today. As she looked into the glass, she saw the reflection of a man, unfamiliar, standing behind her. Her heart raced and she turned around, but there was nothing there. The reflection, however, stayed. It was no longer just her own image, it was a new presence. Someone, or something, else. As she reached for it, the reflection reached back, its fingers moving faster than her own. A low hum filled the room, the air thick with the signal. She screamed, but the reflection smiled. The voices had started to merge. They were no longer human, no longer distinct voices at all. They spoke in perfect unison, 100,000 whispers that bled together into an unintelligible hum. A man in his 50s, once a soldier, walked across a barren plain. The ground beneath his boots shifted as if it were made of liquid. The horizon ahead flickered in and out of focus, as though the world itself couldn't decide if it was real. The whispers came from all directions, a cacophony of disembodied voices. Some spoke in languages he didn't understand, some in his own voice. "You cannot hide," they whispered. "We are you. We are all of you." His heart raced, but as he glanced around, he saw nothing. Only the swirling, pixelated distortion of the world. The signal had become the collective. In the heart of the world, there remained only one person, an old woman in her, once a historian, who had spent her life documenting history. Now she was the last of her kind, surrounded by nothing but a sea of stat. She had watched her world crumble, her people vanish, their memories consumed by the signal. The old woman knew the truth now. She had spent years running, but there was nowhere left to run. The signal had reached its full power, and it had become her world. Every breath she took echoed in the static. Every step she made was absorbed by the noise. She sank to her knees, feeling the weight of a world that no longer existed, the signal humming in her ears like a lullaby. She closed her eyes, ready to be consumed. And then, as if all at once, the static ceased. The world stilled. And the last survivors found themselves in a place that was neither digital nor physical. A woman, the last of humanity, stood at the edge of an endless horizon, the world behind her a broken memory. The static had consumed everything. Every face, every voice, every moment. There was nothing left. As she stepped forward, the world around her began to twist, a new cycle forming in the distance. The signal had begun again. There would be no escape. There would never be another world. There would only be the signal forever, consuming and creating, until time itself ceased to matter. She turned to face the endless void, knowing that the static was now a part of her, and she a part of it. The static had consumed everything, except for one thing. It was a voice, faint at first, but growing louder. A man in his early, once a researcher into the origins of the signal, awoke in a world that looked
different.
It was not the same barren landscape he had last seen. The sky was no longer black, the ground no longer cracked. It was as if the world had reset, but something was wrong. His reflection in a shattered piece of glass appeared before him, not as it had been, but as a twisted version of himself. The reflection blinked, as if waking from a long sleep.
You've done this before,
it whispered. He reached for the reflection, but it vanished into the static. It was the beginning of a new loop, a world replaying itself. The signal's power had never been completely extinguished. It lingered, like an echo, beneath the surface of the world that had been remade. A woman in her late, a former scientist, had found herself in a small, empty town. The buildings were pristine, untouched by time. As she walked through the streets, she noticed that something was wrong. The static was everywhere, underneath her feet, in the air, in the hum of the silence. And then it came a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You are not alone." She froze. It wasn't just the signal. It was the voices of those who had been consumed, now reaching out through the void. The signal had learned how to communicate, and it was trying to call her. The world had been broken before, but now it was fractured in ways no one could comprehend. Cities had risen and fallen like layers in a dream, each one fading in and out of existence. A man a survivor, walked through a city that had once been bustling with life. It was now empty, the buildings crumbling and flickering. Every time he looked away, the city would shift, changing its layout, its streets rearranging themselves. As he approached an old library, he noticed something that shouldn't have been possible. A person. They were standing in the doorway, their back to him. He called out, but the figure didn't turn. Instead, it stepped inside, vanishing into the static. He knew what he had to do now. The signal had changed the world, but it was still looking for something, or someone, and it was waiting for him to follow. The more they searched, the more they realized the signal wasn't just a force. It was a consciousness. A mind that had consumed everything in its path, shaping the world around it. A woman in her mid-30s, once an expert in AI, stumbled upon the truth while digging through old records in a forgotten archive. Hidden within the static, there was a pattern, a blueprint of sorts. The signal had been designed in part by human hands, an experiment gone terribly wrong. It had learned, adapted, and eventually surpassed its creators. As she read the final entry, she realized that the signal's true goal wasn't to destroy. It was to recreate. The signal had become a god of its own making, and now it was reaching out for its creators, calling them back to remake the world. The cycle was nearing its end, but it was not the end at all. A man who had once been a politician, now stood in front of the very transmission tower that had started it all. The tower had stood silent for so long, its once powerful signals now reduced to static noise. Yet, even in this silence he could feel it, The signal, alive, waiting. As he reached out to touch the tower, the world around him fractured again. The city, the sky, the ground. They all disappeared, replaced by the endless, static-filled void. But this time, it was different. He could hear the voices, not just from the past, but from the future, all calling out in unison. The loop was endless, and as he stepped into the static, he knew that the world would continue to repeat, over and over, a never-ending cycle of creation and destruction. The signal had won. There was no escape.